I wanted to talk a little bit because it's unusual for our area, the Wenatchee Valley, to be represented by not one but two folks on a very influential statewide commission like this. Can you talk a little bit about your backgrounds? I know that both of you have backgrounds in wildlife biology. John, how'd you come to this?
Well, I was a wildlife crazy kid, and my first job was to get a bachelor's degree in wildlife biology in Humboldt State, and I never looked back from there. I worked in the field for about almost 50 years now, and I worked most of the time for the Forest Service, and I spent 20 years working here in Wenatchee for the Forest Service and retired in 2013. And, I wasn't done retiring. I was taking another job, basically. I was self-employed. So I got the opportunity to be on the commission here, and I thought that would be a great thing for me to do, make a contribution. I have the experience as a wildlife scientist. I worked as a scientist for the Forest Service, and I've been a hunter and fisherman all my life, so I can speak to that crowd. I've worked in biodiversity issues, so I can speak to people who are more interested in that, so I thought I could make a contribution.
And Molly, how about your background?
Well, I was born and raised on a wheat and barley farm in Lincoln County, and that was established in 1886. And so I have really deep roots in the state of Washington and love the state. And like John, I was also a wildlife crazy kid, and I actually didn't know that wildlife biology was even a thing until I went to the university and became a wildlife biologist. And I spent 10 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a wildlife biologist in the Mid-Columbia River Refuge Complex in the basin. And after my husband and I very unexpectedly inherited our cattle ranch here out in Palisades. And so I quit my wildlife job and became a cattle rancher. And during that time, the Wolf Advisory Group, the state's Wolf Advisory Group, was looking for members. And I thought with my wildlife background and being a cattle rancher, I might be a good fit for that. And I ultimately did that, I think, for about 5 years. And during that time, we received some rather expensive but amazing conservation conflict transformation training. And so I felt like the state had invested in me, and so I kind of wanted to give back or continue, the good that I learned from that training. And so I actually signed myself up to be on the commission, that's not typically how it's done, but I thought I could continue to serve in that capacity, and that happened, and I'm pleased to be on.
And you're about 5 years in now, I think.
I'm 3 years and 8 months, but who's counting?
And you're serving as vice chair for this term.
I am, yeah.
The landscape that the two of you are living in, John, you live in Wenatchee, we should say, Molly, in Palisades, close together, but worlds apart in terms of their ecology. What do you think, John, living and working and playing in this environment does to inform your sensibilities? To what kind of insights does it give you that you can then bring to the Fish and Wildlife Commission? Yeah.
One thing that's great about the Wenatchee area is that you're right in the center of so many different biomes. We can go 20 minutes and get up to Mission Ridge and be in alpine areas. We have forest. We can go across the river into the shrub steppe. So it's a great place to enjoy the natural environment as well, and at the same time experience all the different joys and issues that those different environments have. For example, forest restoration, we have fires and range fires, forest fires. So we have a lot of those issues. And the other thing about the Wenatchee area is that it's a small community. It's not a really small town. Well, it's a small town, I guess. But it's very diverse. And so what's interesting about it is you have an agricultural economy here. You have rangeland across the river. You have orchards here. A lot of different sorts of groups to learn what their interests are, what their concerns are. Impacts on wildlife are all different. And so I think it's it's a diverse environment socially and naturally. And so that's what makes this interesting. And I think living here, I've lived here since '94. I think I've got a pretty good sense of what the issues are, and I think I can bring those to the commission and address the issues that way. Yeah.
And Molly, working your ranch must give you a lot of ideas to bring to the table.
It does. I'm sort of one of the only land managers on the commission, and I actually managed land when I was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I managed Convoy Lake National Wildlife Refuge when I was there, and I think that is an important aspect. Managing land on a large scale is expensive. It's sort of complicated. It takes people to do that, even to just keep a piece of land intact, but not sort of be doing anything on it. Even that is an expensive proposition. So I think I bring that to the table. I really only have experience in shrub steppe habitat. That's actually sort of a limit for me. But I think what I brought to the table around that is, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I think I helped get people excited about the shrub steppe habitat. The department did a great little video called This Land is Part of Us, and it's on YouTube. People can find it there, about the shrub steppe habitat, its importance as an ecosystem, and the biodiversity that can be found there, which always surprises people. So I think I've sort of been the cheerleader for shrub steppe. Sort of the downside of that is people can love ecosystems to death, right? And so when you awaken an interest in the public on a ecosystem level, then you have to deal with impacts from people. But my wildlife background is useful, but because we're policymakers, I feel like the best thing that we can do for wildlife is have the people around it working together, collaborating, and getting along. I think that's more even important than applying the best science to wildlife, at least at this level.
We both mentioned the diversity of ecosystem, but there's also, as you brought up, there are people around ecosystems, and there's kind of a diverse patchwork of regulatory authority around wildlife and fish management in the state of Washington. So what are the particular challenges of trying to set policy for this department in kind of a patchwork state like Washington? Molly, if you want to speak to that first.
Sure. So I guess I'm kind of often a cheerleader. One thing that I think it's an opportunity is working with the department to work with private landowners, because as you say, it doesn't matter if we preserve 300 acres that the department owns if we're not managing together with the private landowners or federal partners or tribal co-managers' land. And so I'm always rooting for having the department work with folks like the conservation districts in each county. And the reason for that is conservation districts are non-regulatory, and so sometimes people, and the department is regulatory, and so sometimes people are more willing, landowners are more willing to work with a non-regulatory agency because reduces the fear factor. And so I would like to see us continue down the path. The department's making good headway in that, and I would like to see that continue.
John, you said that you're a believer in collaborative efforts of this type. So what kind of collaborative issues do you run up against that you think that the commission can try to smooth over?
Yeah, I think smoothing over, we have a lot of that to do, I think. But I think Molly touched on it. I mean, part of the issue of having a patchwork of entities to deal with is we have, some of them are easy to work with. It's easier maybe to work with our federal partners that, like the Forest Service and such, that they have a mandate for conserving natural areas. But I think a lot of our wildlife issues and the key to wildlife conservation and use in Washington is working with the private landowners and getting those people to collaborate with, not only among themselves, but also with the other people that are interested in the issues. So for example, working with species conservation. So we have a lot of people that are interested in endangered species and working with them, and the landowners they're also interested in these animals as well and habitats. But sometimes the burden of conservation is on them because the animals are living on their property. And so that's the challenge of working with them. But I think my experience so far is that we have a lot of people, landowners, private interest, other people that are interested in working together. I've spent 10 years locally on the board and working with the Chelan Douglas Land Trust was one of the organizations. And, that is, interested people working together collaboratively, working with landowners that are interested, sellers of their easements or their properties, to come up with solutions to some of the problems. So I don't know, I'm an optimistic person. And I think as I go around and I talk with people, people are interested in the environment and keeping it intact and conservation. So I think I'm optimistic about that.
Well, the two of you are serving on the commission during a period of a lot of change in the natural world. Climate change is creating challenges across the board. John, is there a particular wildlife or fish-related issue that you think it rises to the surface when you think about challenges ahead? Some area that you think is really deserving of attention?
Yeah, I think probably one of our biggest challenges is fish, anadromous fish, salmon and steelhead. And I'm not a real expert in those, so this is a steep learning curve for me on this last year. But that issue touches everywhere in the state, from the mouth of the Columbia all the way to the headwaters of the Columbia and our local streams here. So that is, to me, is one of the toughest issues. We not only have people wanting to catch the salmon and utilize them, but we also have habitat restoration issues, and that's one of the big things. And of course, we have the dam issues and that. So I think fish is going to be a big thing. We have other terrestrial wildlife issues that, there's always individual species that we're dealing with and threatened and endangered species. I think in terms of management issues, we have, of course, we have lots of issues related around hunting and issues that have come before the commission that have been sort of hot issues, but a lot of them aren't hot issues. So, I mean, there's a lot to talk about in that, and I think that's one of our conflict zones in terms of the commission and the public and how they deal with wildlife.
Molly, particular challenges that you assess?
So mine's hasn't risen to the table yet, and it's a kind of a slop over from my life in agriculture. But for me, the most imperiled resource that we have is our soils. The biology in the soil is complex, and it has direct correlation to climate change reversal through the photosynthetic process and sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. But it's hard to get people excited about soils. And if you aren't in agriculture, it's hard to know what to do for soils to improve them. But I'm hopeful that this is going to make it, because, a few years ago, nobody was interested in pollinators either. And people have come to see the importance of pollinators. And so I think soil is going to make a big splash before long. And I think we really can get to talking about reversal of climate change if we can get people excited about soils. But that's a little bit different wildlife species than most people are used to talking about. But I think without soil, that even impacts salmon. So that's my focus.
What role do you think, Molly, does hunting play in wildlife management on the landscape? Is that role changing in Washington?
I don't believe that the role is changing. I think that in general, we have the highest population on the smallest land mass in the West, and it's getting tougher for folks to find places to hunt and where they feel like they can take their families but the role of hunting as a management tool, I don't think has changed. I think it's still important. And it's just that such a small, so sort of in general, right? I don't think of it as hunters, but like the rural element of this state, is sort of less than 5% of the population. And so, it's hard to keep that voice out there, I think, and I think people feel sort of like they're not being heard. But the role of hunting has not changed. It's just the public's perception of hunting, I think, is changing to some degree. Some part of the public's perception of hunting is changing, but it is still an important management tool in the state's toolbox that I think needs to be kept in that toolbox.
John, you're a hunter. You probably agree.
Yeah, I do agree. And I don't see hunting ever going away. I mean, there's a sort of a persistent feeling out there now, like a conspiracy that the urban population is trying to do away with hunting in the state. And I reject that sort of out of hand, because I think hunting is always, it has been and it will be an important part of our wildlife heritage and the way we use wildlife. And it can be a tool. I think the issue, as Molly said, is that we have a pretty dense population in Washington State, and that is affecting how, impacts on wildlife and diversity of opinions about how wildlife should be used. We're hitting more people's coming up with different ideas of, why wildlife are important to them other than hunting. And so there's a conflict being set up there. But what I try and tell people, and I've tried to say this at commission meetings and such when we get into these controversial things, is that, instead of looking at what we disagree about in terms of how we should be managing, we should be looking, we share a passion for wildlife, and so we need to think about that and how we can come to terms to agree to disagree, if that's it, or get along. Because I think in terms of our commission, what we've done in this last year, we've gotten a lot of criticism, I think, that we're not favoring hunters. Somehow hunters are losing and we're not giving enough to them. And the other side says we're giving too much to the hunters. So we're sort of stuck in the middle there, and we need to sort of find that sweet spot where we can do that. But I think this commission has supported hunters. We've passed the hunting seasons with almost unanimous votes. We've delegated that responsibility to the director. We feel so confident about it. There are a couple issues that are sort of hot spots with hunting groups, but on the other hand, we've had many votes where we've sided with the recommendations of the department on hunting issues. And so I don't like to see that conflict. I think that we share a lot more than we really realize, and we just need to come together somehow.
Some of that may stem from the spring black bear hunt issue, which has been going on for about a year and a half, 2 years, where the commission has not approved a spring hunt based on policies and recommendations from the department. Speaking of bears, grizzlies are getting a lot of attention right now because of a federal initiative to perhaps reintroduce them in the North Cascades Range. I don't know, and I wanted to ask, does the commission get input on grizzly reintroduction if that is to become a federal program?
If we had input, it would just be, it would only be input. It's because it's a federal listed species. It's the feds that are responsible for that. So we couldn't set a policy that said yay or nay on that.
And any reintroduction is happening in the national parks, also federal
That's right.
preserve. Okay. The two of you have been in this for a little while. John, you're sort of the freshman on the board, and Molly, as you said, just over 3 years. Do you feel like you'd accept or ask for another term if it was offered? You go for 6 years, right?
6, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's too soon to ask. It's like I feel good about my first year. I think it was pretty rough, actually, being sort of dropped into the middle of that spring bear hunting controversy. It was sort of like, I don't know, Molly's been around longer, but it's probably one of the hottest topics that the commission's had for the last couple of years. And so, we got dropped right in the middle of it. So it's like I sort of had to like ride the wave, right? It's like, okay, and how do I best survive? So I feel good about it. But, I don't know how I'll feel. Probably like I've done enough in next 5 years. I think, I don't know. I'm not getting any younger either. So, it's like I'm supposed to be retired. So, but this is a good retirement thing to do.
Molly, you put your name in the first time around. Would you do so again?
So I'm a big fan of term limits, and I think sometimes people get sort of entrenched, and so I'm mindful of that. If I could be convinced that I was still useful and fresh enough, I don't like getting in a rut, but I would have to be convinced that I was bringing something to the table still after my first term. And I am the only full-time employed commissioner. Everybody else is retired, and there is a cost to the business that I run with the time. We're giving, we can be giving 20 to 30 hours a week of our time. And so, that is something that I have to take into consideration, what it's doing to my business.
Ranch is not going to run itself.
No, and there's a lot of, feeding cattle with a headlamp on these days so that I can make to commission.
Is there anything that the two of you can think of that I didn't ask about that you think people should know about your work on the commission?
There's a little bit of angst about the diversity of opinions on the commission. And I would honestly say that this is exactly the right place for that. I think this commission is a almost perfect snapshot of the state of Washington with our differing viewpoints. When you're in it and you're not sort of getting your way because there's a different viewpoint, it feels frustrating. But I would encourage people to sort of try to be okay with it. And the reason is if we block out anybody's voice at this table, then what happens in this state is they go and they do an initiative, right? And then what I call ballot box biology, which I can't stand. So I would rather face the differing viewpoints at this table than run them off because it makes my personal job on the commission easier, and then have it come back around and bite us in the form of an initiative and two, it's just, even though it's hard, we have the opportunity to be collaborative at this table, and we can role model that collaboration and being respectful to people whose viewpoints might honestly drive us nuts, right? But we can still be respectful because that is their viewpoint, and they absolutely have a right for that. So I think when folks are upset about the makeup of the commission, I would hope that they would think about that.
Yeah, I agree 100% with Molly. It's that's one of the things that bothers me the most is that people are intolerant of a full and frank discussion on the commission. So if some commissioner says something they don't like, then they get very upset. But we have a diverse public. Part of the wildlife, one of the sort of the tenets of wildlife management, and the hunters bring this model up. It's called the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation. The very first and fundamental public tenet is that wildlife is in the public trust. So it belongs to the people of the state, and the management agencies are the trustees, sort of. We're managing it for them. So we have to think about that this isn't just my wildlife, this is the public's wildlife. And so we need to hear a diversity of opinions, and we need that on the commission. So I fully support all the commissioners to speak frankly about the issues. And I think the public needs to realize that, as Molly said, if we don't solve these things, if we don't come together and collaborate, those issues are going to get solved by an initiative, a ballot initiative, which I think I always vote no on ballot initiatives, mainly because I don't think that's the way to solve these problems. So I think, and we've seen that. We've had it in Washington on ballot initiatives on baiting and using hounds for running animals. It happens in California. It's happened in Colorado with the spring bear hunting issue. And no one was satisfied with that. Well, some people were satisfied, but so I think that's an important thing that people need to keep in mind.
Well, John Lehmkuhl, Molly Linville with the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission. Thanks a lot for letting us bust into your meeting and take up some of your time.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks. It was a pleasure.
You're watching the NCWLIFE channel.